Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 1:01. We will finish at 2:01. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Former residents of the Home for Coloured Children are saying that the Premier's panel is the wrong approach and will divide their community. Members of UJAMA have reiterated this in their statement on April 5th, saying, and I quote, "The panel suggested by the government will re-victimize the victims and will not provide transparency and clarity for the African Nova Scotia community," end of quote. My question, why is the Premier insisting on proceeding with the process that will re-victimize the victims of abuse?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the process that we are seeking to follow is exactly the one that was recommended not only by the Voices group but by other African Nova Scotian groups. We're doing so, of course, to promote reconciliation and to healing and to ensure that there is a full examination. We want all of this to take place compassionately, understanding that there is at the same time a legal process underway that is dealing with the question of compensation.
Excuse me, hold on a sec. Kenny, can you go see that camera guy up there in the gallery? He's shooting people in the gallery up here. Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his second supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has heard from former residents, Mr. Speaker, from UJAMA, from restorative justice experts, that an independent panel is not what will help the victims heal. Instead, Mr. Speaker, they have said this panel will do nothing but divide the community and continue the hurt. My question to the Premier, why would the Premier commit to a process that will divide a community rather than support its healing?
Honourable the Premier.
That is not true, and I'm going to file now with you and table a letter that is dated the 7th of March 2013, which we received from the Voices group. In it, it says, and I'll just read that. I can't read it all because there's a lot in it, but it says, "Thank you for your letter of earlier this week. I'm very appreciative of your government's expressed willingness to engage in a restorative process to bring long overdue healing to abuse victims of the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children. If we are able to settle civil claims, and as I've said, Mr. Speaker, that is a separate matter of compensation, we do not, and I want to stress this, we do not
The Honourable Premier has the floor.
We do not propose a public inquiry per se. Rather than finger-pointing, a restorative approach to justice seeks to understand the context and causes of harm. The designer will help us identify who was involved or affected and who else can affect the outcome and bring them into the process." And then further on, it goes on to say, "We will be committed to an approach that promotes the inclusion and participation among various stakeholders. These will include the former staff, social workers, policymakers, members of the African Nova Scotia community, etc." Mr. Speaker, this is exactly the process that we have committed to. We are pleased today to have announced that Robert Wright, a well-known African Nova Scotia social worker with extensive experience, will be called upon to put together the terms of reference. Mr. Speaker, we genuinely believe and hope that this will adequately and completely address the situation.
Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the important part of that letter is called restorative justice, Mr. Speaker, and the victims, Mr. Speaker, of the abuse at the Home for Coloured Children, Mr. Speaker, have been denied justice, Mr. Speaker, and the Premier knows that the panel put together by his government does not allow the voices of those victims to be heard, and it does not have, Mr. Speaker, the legal requirement to force people to testify at a public inquiry to ensure that Nova Scotians know exactly what happened at that Home for Coloured Children and that the victims finally get their voices heard, Mr. Speaker, and get served justice in the province of Nova Scotia, where it has been denied for decades, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier again. Why would the Premier commit to a process that will divide a community rather than begin the healing?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition shows an extraordinarily poor understanding of the manner in which Public Inquiries Act works, and the manner in which restorative justice works, and the way that reconciliation and healing takes place. In fact, he is right only about this thing, that it does not start by trying to divide communities. And in fact, as I pointed out in that letter, we did exactly the opposite from that. We brought together broad-based groups among the African Nova Scotia community to try and reach a consensus on the kind of process that would actually bring about reconciliation and healing. Mr. Speaker, that is what our government is dedicated to. It is one that I believe that the people of Nova Scotia are committed to, and we cannot afford to repeat the mistakes of the past. We cannot afford to repeat what happened in the Shelburne case, Mr. Speaker. We must learn from the past if we are truly to have a restorative process.
I would like to remind our guests in the galleries that under the rules of our host, they are not allowed to show either approval or disapproval of anything that happens here on the floor during our proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After many calls from both opposition parties and the former residents of the Home for Coloured Children, the Premier actually had us believing that he may finally be taking those calls seriously about calling a full public inquiry. But then, Mr. Speaker, he sent his legal team in and had them quash the very stories in court that the residents were wanting to tell. Now we see that Tony Smith, the spokesperson for Voices, has told reporters that they feel misled by what the Premier has said about his intentions around a public inquiry, and I will table, for the benefit of the Premier, Mr. Smith's comments. The Premier just tabled a letter in this House, which he had previously said shows that they want a panel and not an inquiry, but that's not what that letter says, Mr. Speaker, and so I will ask the Premier, why not do the right thing and call a full public inquiry so that Nova Scotia can get on with putting this horrible chapter behind us and allow the residents to have the closure that they deserve.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the letter, I think, is pretty clear. It says we do not propose a public inquiry per se. That is an exact quote from what it says. So, and that, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what it means. It means that we look to terms of reference. And in fact, the terms of reference have not even been set yet. What we have done is we have selected an individual who is well respected in the African Nova Scotia community, who has the skill set to put together an appropriate terms of reference. The terms of reference looks at the context, looks at the history, looks at the proper form for giving people the ability to have their voices heard. That's exactly what the terms of reference does. Mr. Speaker, we have in this caucus a deep affection for the questions associated with social justice. We have committed ourselves to them for most of our lives, and we do so in this regard as well.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, no wonder Voices and the former residents have lost faith in the way this government has handled their cause. Saying that they don't oppose a public inquiry per se is not the same as the way the Premier characterized it, which is that they were calling for some panel. That's not the same thing at all, Mr. Speaker. And to try and comfort them today by saying that the terms of reference for the panel will satisfy them, when those terms of reference are not even written. In fact, I'll table the Premier's own release that says they've appointed someone to write them, shows, Mr. Speaker, the kind of games that are being played on such an important issue. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier stop playing these kind of games and get on with the job of simply calling a public inquiry that will satisfy not only residents but all Nova Scotians that they have a government that will do the right thing?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you want to talk about, I really think this is a shame that the Leader of the Conservative Party would stoop to, this kind of a response, because, of course, that is the ultimate in playing games. You try and dismiss what it is, the work that's already been done, the consultations that have already taken place, and you suggest somehow that there is an alternative process that would somehow be better. But, Mr. Speaker, the first thing that an inquiry would do, of any nature, of course, is set terms of reference. That is exactly what would have to happen in any case. It is fundamental to the work, whether it's a panel, an inquiry, and you can name it what you like. It is the work that gets done that is the important thing, and that is what actually yields up the result. I understand, for example, the Leader of the Opposition does not understand that you might be able to subpoena people, you can't actually make them testify. You know, all of those kinds of things are of course, very important considerations.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, so let's call it what we want. Let's call a full public inquiry. That has a definition in the Public Inquiries Act. It is what the residents are asking for. It is what Nova Scotians know leads to ultimate justice and the ability for the province to move on. Let's not call it something different. Let's call a full public inquiry, as the Premier says. Let's call it what it is. Let's call it what's needed. Then, truly, Mr. Speaker, the residents will know that they don't have a government that's playing games, that they don't have to go through some alternative process that doesn't satisfy their needs, so that years from now we're no further ahead. The Premier has a chance to do the right thing, to stop the shell game that's going on, and so I'll ask him, will he, if he truly believes that we should call it what it is, call a public inquiry?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Leader of the Conservative Party thinks he knows better than all of the people that we have consulted with and all of the individuals who we have talked to about this issue. As I said, you know, we talked to the members from the Voices group. They were in my office. They followed up with the letter which I have just read to you. And during those conversations, they were very animated about the need, the desire to get to the question of their experience, what happened while they were in the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children. And we said, and we are committed to a vehicle for that expression, one that not only provides them with the opportunity to tell their story, but one to look at the historical context in which it occurred, to look at the actions of governments of the day, which of course were Liberal and Conservative governments. Mr. Speaker, to look very specifically at what the societal norms of the day were, so that we can try and understand the experience that we had. Mr. Speaker, this is an attempt to ensure the most transparent and complete examination of the issue.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, today residents of the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children had a press conference to share information about this government's active attempts to silence victims of abuse. While victims have called for a full public inquiry and restorative justice, this Premier instead has called for a think tank to conduct an independent panel to develop terms of reference for this panel. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier tell the members of this House who sits on his independent think tank?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have no idea what the Leader of the Opposition is talking about. I don't think I'm alone in that. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, we have all of the work was conducted through my office with the cooperation of the appropriate ministers, including the Minister of Justice, Minister of Community Services, the member for Halifax Needham, who was the Minister of Finance, of course, was the Minister of Health, the Minister responsible for the Economic Rural Development and Tourism, Mr. Speaker. We brought together the resources of the government to hear from a broad-based group of people. They came from many different organizations, including the faith community, including groups of interested citizens. Yes, some of them have past experience in public life, and of course they would, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in all of this, in every answer this Premier's gotten, he's never once mentioned the victims, Mr. Speaker, of this abuse, Mr. Speaker. Not once has he mentioned the victims. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, my first question today, Mr. Speaker, I said, and I quoted from a letter that he would have received from UJAMA that is supporting the Voices organization, Mr. Speaker, and it said, Mr. Speaker, UJAMA's black family members held a meeting on the 5th and 6th, 2013 to support Voices organizations in their demand for a public inquiry. The panel suggested by the government will re-victimize the victims and will not provide transparency, clarity to the African Nova Scotia community, Mr. Speaker. And UJAMA represents African Nova Scotians from one end of this province to the other, Mr. Speaker. So my question is, outside, Mr. Speaker, a former NDP candidate, a former NDP MLA who speaks on behalf, Mr. Speaker, do not speak on behalf of the residents, Mr. Speaker. And I want to remind the host that that letter was signed by Rocky Jones, who I know the Premier knows, Mr. Speaker. So finally, will the Premier admit that he appointed a group of individuals to actively silence former residents, Mr. Speaker?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition's assertions, besides being demeaning and insulting, are also untrue. They are, in fact, the furthest thing from the truth. In fact, the Voices group, when we met with them, said that we were the first government to ever take them seriously and meet with them. Mr. Speaker, that is what they told us when they met with us. Mr. Speaker, I can only say this: we have set out. There is nothing that hasn't been completely transparent in what we have done. We have at every turn tried to accommodate the desires of the Voices group, and he says we didn't mention the victims. We have talked about nothing else but the victims and trying to ensure that they have the pathway to restoration and healing. That, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what we have done.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell you what's insulting and demeaning is that the fact that the Premier is ignoring the victims, Mr. Speaker, of abuse, Mr. Speaker. That's what's insulting and demeaning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members from the African Nova Scotia community, Voices, Mr. Speaker, people, victims, have asked this government for a full, open, public inquiry. Mr. Speaker, and what they've received from this government, Mr. Speaker, has been stonewalling at every attempt to, even last week when they sent their team of lawyers down to the courthouse, Mr. Speaker, to squash affidavits from victims of abuse. What else are they to think, Mr. Speaker, when their own government is trying to have their voices squashed in a court? Will the Premier do the right thing and call a full, open, public inquiry?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what he is suggesting would not adequately, in fact, address the issues. And what we have done, in fact, Mr. Speaker, I have met with every person who has requested to speak or meet with me on this issue. I have made myself available. Whether they are victims, whether they are represented by the Voices group, whether they are represented by other groups, it didn't matter to me, because what I wanted to understand was what the best route, best path forward is. Mr. Speaker, I spent years in the courts. I know very well how adversarial those proceedings are. I understand very well that it is not a very perfect system, and it is certainly not the kind of system that leads to the kind of result that we want. And I've been told over and over again by the Voices group that this is not about money. They said we're not worried about that. So that's, I take that at face value, and I say the question of compensation, the question of the lawsuit is over here. The question of reconciliation, of healing, of understanding the circumstances and the pain of the individuals, that is what we are engaged in here, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the NDP track record for election financing is abysmal. During the 2009 election campaign, the NDP took illegal donations from unions that totaled $45,000. When they were discovered, the NDP promised to return the illegal donations, but misled the public and failed to do so. The offence was so egregious, Mr. Speaker, and serious in nature that Elections Nova Scotia levelled its first ever fine of such a nature to the Premier and his NDP, with the largest fine possible under the law. Mr. Speaker, it is widely speculated that an election is imminent within the next few months. My question to the Premier, will he commit to all Nova Scotians today that he will govern himself within the bounds of the law during this upcoming election, not conduct any illegal acts as his party did in 2009? I don't know what they're laughing at. This is fact, and I'll table the documents. And can he table documents with the Clerk of the House that prove the donations were finally returned and that the NDP paid the maximum fine levied under the Elections Act?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all the things that he has said is untrue. That's the first thing. That's the first thing. In fact, the Chief Electoral Officer specifically says that the party did not and could not have known about the nature of the contributions. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to confuse him with the facts, but, you know, we're talking about a party that for years existed on the proceeds of crime, Mr. Speaker, that existed on trust funds, which we still don't know the disposition of, Mr. Speaker. We do know that some $1.2 million was transferred under the control of this leader into the finances of the Liberal Party. What they did with it, of course, we do not know. But, you know, perhaps we will find out.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if he paid attention to the facts and the information that we've actually tabled in this House, he would know what happened with that. And let's put this into perspective, Mr. Speaker. The Premier is talking about something that happened with the Liberal Party in 1970. I'm talking about something that happened in 2009 under his leadership. Under his leadership, nobody else's. The contraventions, Mr. Speaker, when imposing their maximum fine under the Act,
Order, please. The honourable member for Yarmouth has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When imposing their maximum fine under the Act, Elections Nova Scotia stated the contraventions were serious and not simply technical contraventions. They involved a significant amount of money. The acts were so serious, Mr. Speaker, that the matter was then referred to the police immediately after the NDP were fined. Recently, Elections Nova Scotia, they're not laughing now, are they, over there, Mr. Speaker? Elections Nova Scotia identified a loophole. Recently, Elections Nova Scotia identified a loophole that would allow the NDP to inappropriately finance their election campaigns in this province, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians expect that unions and corporations will no longer be allowed to provide financial benefits to political parties, and that includes providing election loan guarantees. So my question to the Premier is, will he commit today to all Nova Scotians that his party will not accept any donations, loans, or loan guarantees from unions or corporations in this upcoming election? Yes or no?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it is phenomenal that the member for Yarmouth tries to say this is something that happened in the 1970s. Mr. Speaker, just months ago, they were using this money to fund their advertising budgets, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they transferred money over the last 3 years. They can't wean themselves off. They can't wean themselves off it, Mr. Speaker. And I realize.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I realize that this has been a very difficult session for the Liberal Party. I realize that, you know, the electricity plan that they had was thrown out by the New Brunswick government because of its absolute failure. I realize that it's having difficulty keeping track of where their members are or where they live. Mr. Speaker, I understand that this has been a very difficult time, but we are simply unmasking who the Liberal Party actually is.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today, a new report entitled "Can Nova Scotians Afford to Eat Healthy?" Was released. It's a food costing report for 2012, produced by Food Arc, which concludes that over the last 4 years, families in Nova Scotia are having more and more trouble feeding their own families nutritious food because of the cost, and I will share that with the House and with the Premier, Mr. Speaker. They're having more trouble providing nutritious meals to their families. At the same time, we've had 4 years of no real wage growth, 4 years of growing unemployment, 4 years of the highest taxes in the country and skyrocketing power rates. Mr. Speaker, families deserve much better than that. And so I will ask the Premier to explain why his pledge to make life better for today's families has gone so horribly wrong.
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Conservative Party should read the report. It actually commends our government, who have increased income assistance rates. We increased minimum wage to the point where it is now among the highest, if not the highest in the country. And it's hard to believe that the Leader of the Conservative Party that attacked the increase in the minimum wage, the very thing that puts food on the table for poor Nova Scotia families. Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of our record with respect to the support of the working poor and of those on income assistance. Mr. Speaker, we're the ones who are returning the income tax to poor seniors who are on the GIS. These are initiatives that the Conservative government had 10 years to do and never did.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to point out that there's absolutely no accuracy to the idea that I attacked the minimum wage. I wish in such a serious question we'd get a serious answer. Mr. Speaker, the report shows that 23,561 people in Nova Scotia visited a food bank in the month of March 2012 alone. That's a 5% increase over the same month in 2011, and the number of visitors to our food banks has gone up an astounding 40% since 2008. Those are facts, Mr. Speaker. Those are real numbers. Of course, that 40% number should sound familiar because that is, in fact, as well the amount that our power rates have gone up, a price that all Nova Scotians have to pay, and I'll table both of those facts from StatsCan for the benefit of the Premier. Now, I'll ask the Premier this. Since no one asked Nova Scotians, particularly our most vulnerable, if they wanted to pay the highest taxes or the highest power rates in Canada when they were voting in the last election, I will ask the Premier to explain why he is forcing those very families to pay so much more now and have less to provide a nutritious meal to their own children.
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the suggestion made by the Leader of the Conservative Party is outrageous for the following reasons. First of all, we inherited the Nova Scotia power regime from the Conservative government, and the reason why power rates went up is because they tied us to fossil fuel rates year after year after year. Secondly, with respect to the question of taxation, we actually created the affordable tax credit, the poverty reduction tax credit, which actually takes some of that tax increase, in fact, much more of it than they would have paid in tax, and puts it into the pockets of those people who are the worst off, Mr. Speaker, meaning that they have more money to buy the things that they need for them and their families. In addition, Mr. Speaker, we invested almost $130 million in poverty reduction initiatives, Mr. Speaker, to deal with exactly those communities. Everything from increases in IA to increases in the per diems paid to foster parents, Mr. Speaker. That is the record of this government.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's sad to see that the Premier seems to be telling our families here in Nova Scotia they're struggling to get by, that the NDP answer is that they should go on income assistance under his government. But that is not a good enough answer, Mr. Speaker. The report shows that a family of four trying to eat healthy in 2012, that cost 26% more than it did 5 short years ago. In some areas of Nova Scotia, like Cape Breton, like Guysborough, In Cumberland County, it costs even more than that, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps that's why in our rural areas, the 10,300 people have moved away in the last 4 years, and I'll table that, and 6,200 have lost their full-time jobs. Those are the issues that the Premier wants to focus on, creating real opportunity with real wages and real growth. Instead, Mr. Speaker, he has made life much more expensive for our most vulnerable citizens. And so I will ask the Premier, why does he insist on making them pay more for HST, more for their power, when it is causing so much hardship?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we changed the system in order to put more money into the pockets of exactly those people. In fact, as I said, the affordability tax credit, the poverty reduction tax credit puts more money in their pocket. Mr. Speaker, we invested in job growth. We invested in ensuring that there was a minimum wage that was enough to support people, Mr. Speaker. We have supported young people graduating from university with a graduate retention tax credit. Mr. Speaker, right across the board, where people have found themselves without the financial security they need, they have found the support of this government.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Out of desperation, the NDP government often resort to going back in time in order to deflect and defend their dismal record when it comes to governing. So let's review the history, Mr. Speaker. In 1999, under the leadership of a Liberal government, the wait time for orthopedic surgery, 6 months. Today, if you are lucky, it's about 14 months. The wait time for general surgery in 1999, a little over 1 month. Today, it's about 7 months. And, Mr. Speaker, 8 years ago, the wait time for an MRI, a little over 2 months. Well, today, on the average, it is about 7 months. I had a constituent, Mr. Brian Nelson, in my office this week telling my assistant he's waiting 17 months. Could the Minister of Health and Wellness tell us why this NDP government has disappointed Nova Scotians time and time again when it comes to addressing health care wait times?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, the information, the question that the member brings forward is really meaningless because we did not have accurate information around wait times. That didn't come in across the country to about the mid-2000s, Mr. Speaker. That truly reflects what's going around and what's happening across jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker. We've worked hard over the last almost 4 years to improve health care delivery here in Nova Scotia. We inherited a financial mess from the former government, Mr. Speaker. Along with that was a health care system that was unsustainable. We've made positive changes within the health care system over the last 4 years so that it will be sustainable into the future, and I look forward to working extremely hard as we improve the system in the coming years, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians not only deserve a better response than that, they deserve better from the NDP government when it comes to addressing wait times. After all, $34 million in federal funding, specifically for wait time reduction. And how does government spend the money? They put it into general revenue to help balance the books, Mr. Speaker. To add insult to injury, this NDP government during its mandate has spent close to $1 million advertising their Better Care Sooner plan. Well, how ironic, Mr. Speaker. Would the minister admit to the thousands of Nova Scotians languishing on wait times that his NDP government has failed them?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What the member should do is apologize to Nova Scotians for the chaos that the Liberals left the healthcare system when they were last in government, Mr. Speaker. We're still feeling the effects today, Mr. Speaker. He mentions $34 million of federal transfers coming into the province, Mr. Speaker. We appreciate the minimum support that we do get from the federal government. We spend $3.9 billion in health care, Mr. Speaker. We spend that to ensure that people have access to the health care services that they need, Mr. Speaker. Unlike when the last time the ministers of health from the Liberal government flew around firing nurses, closing hospital beds, Mr. Speaker. We're working with district health authorities to ensure that they have the services that Nova Scotians need, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the 2012 report on participatory food costing shows that the amount of money it costs for families and individuals to eat healthy in Nova Scotia. The report takes into consideration the rising cost of power, transportation, taxes, and food. And you know, Mr. Speaker, after a family receiving income assistance pays their bills and puts food on the table, that family is $758 in the hole. At the end of the month, a single mother earning minimum wage will be left $823 in the hole once she feeds her children. And I will table that information. So my question through you to the Premier, what does the Premier have to say to the families struggling to keep their heads above water? Should they sacrifice their groceries or pay their power bills?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the next time the member for Victoria stands up, he should begin it with an apology to the people of Nova Scotia for the miserable energy policy put in place by the government that he was a part of that led exactly to the kind of increases that we have seen. And I would encourage him to encourage the government and to thank the government for ensuring that we are on a path that will prevent that from happening in the future, Mr. Speaker. The first thing we did, and Mr. Speaker, one of the very first action we took was to put down the price of electricity by 10%.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government has raised the allowance for income assistance, but when shown against the incredible increases in power rates, taxes, and overall cost of living, it simply won't cut it. The NDP are leaving more and more Nova Scotians deeper and deeper in the hole. So my question through you to the Premier, does the Premier agree with this report that life is becoming unaffordable for today's families?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is a member of a government who used to have their Department of Finance reach into the pockets of the poorest seniors in our province, those receiving GIS, and take money from them, Mr. Speaker, by income tax. Mr. Speaker, we increased the IA rates. We took the HST and we actually put it in a fund and took that money and gave it to those exact people through the affordability tax credit, through the poverty tax reduction tax credit, Mr. Speaker. This government put money into the hands of the poorest people in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and we did it in ways that no government has ever done it before.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I guess that's why the 2012 Hunger Count survey shows 23,561 Nova Scotians relied on food banks in March. That's in 1 month, Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that. Today's report shows that healthy food is unaffordable to families. Given these statistics, it's unconscionable for the government to allow power rates to skyrocket, keep taxes so high, and let unemployment continue to climb. Mr. Speaker, the NDP need to stop making people choose between paying their bills and putting food on the table. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier reverse his expensive policies and create the economic conditions Nova Scotians need to prosper?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what is unconscionable is that you had a government that was receiving $450 million a year in offshore royalties, who spent more than $1 billion over and above expanding budgets and didn't do a thing to address poverty, did not do a thing to address those people who are most vulnerable in our society, Mr. Speaker. That is the record of the Conservative government. This government brought in the poverty reduction tax credit, brought in the affordability tax credit, increased income assistance, increased the per diems paid to foster parents, increased the child tax benefit, Mr. Speaker. We are the ones who took the HST off of home electricity, put in place an efficiency program to provide better efficiencies for the homes that those poor people actually live in to reduce the cost of their electricity budgets. Mr. Speaker, that is what this government did.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the spring lobster season is underway in Nova Scotia, and once again we see fishermen being faced with rock-bottom prices for lobster. Mr. Speaker, everyone in this House knows just how important lobster fishery is to the economies of rural Nova Scotia and to the economy of our entire province. As we speak, Mr. Speaker, fishermen in Guysborough, Antigonish and Pictou counties are tying up their boats in protest over low lobster prices. So my question is the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture concerned by the low prices for lobster for Nova Scotia fishermen, or better yet, does he have any plan to address low lobster prices in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. I know certainly I am deeply concerned. That's why we have met consistently with our federal counterpart, Mr. Ashfield, and the Atlantic Ministers of Fisheries. And I can tell you that we also have made a presentation to Ottawa recently in early February. I suggest the members opposite on both parties get that presentation, and I'd love to have the opportunity to talk about diversifying the fisheries and creating more jobs in the rural communities. And certainly this is something that's very important to us. We have invested in the Lobster Council of Canada, and we are monitoring this and working with the industry, and I thank the member for bringing this question forward.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we're hearing of prices such as $3.75 a pound. Mr. Speaker, we all know that anything under $5 is basically such that fishermen cannot make ends meet. As I said earlier, we all know the important role this plays in the economies of rural Nova Scotia and in the economy of the province. Any time that lobster prices are low, it not only affects the fishermen, it affects the growth of our province and the revenues of our province. So again, I ask the Minister of Fisheries, what plan does he have in place to address the low price of lobster in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, again, we have worked with our federal counterpart, Mr. Ashfield. We are also working with the industry on the certification of the MSC, and we also took a presentation to Ottawa, and one of them that we talked about in there is making sure that the lobster industry does not include quotas, which I can point out that the federal government and the third party, the PCs, are suggesting introducing. We also took out the very first thing that we did as a minister of this portfolio was took the vendor's fee off for fishing for licenses for roadside sales. That's the very first thing that I did in this mandate. And again, Mr. Speaker, we have stood up to Ottawa when it comes to the owner-operating and fleet separation policy. Again, something that the federal party and the PCs have introduced and want to dismantle the independent inshore fisheries. Mr. Speaker, we have done a lot for this industry. We understand the struggle that's going on with the low prices, and we look forward to working with the industry. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be to the Minister of Finance today. In January, this government flip-flopped on U-Vent and homebrew stores. After public backlash, the government backed off and said rules for U-Vents would soon be in place. But businesses are still waiting, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister, it's been 4 months now. Will the Minister of Finance explain why regulations for the province's U-Vent stores take so long to develop?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, and I thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, staff in my department are currently looking at the various regulatory regimes across the country with respect to U-Vin, U-Brew, and they will be analyzing that We also will be doing a consultation with the industry and other interested parties. You know, that work will be able to get underway after this House is no longer in session.
The honourable member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer. The regulations for U-Vent stores are important, but Muskrat Falls is a huge project that is important to ratepayers as well. Just yesterday, when asked about the U-Vent rules, the finance minister said, "I'm not sure. I guess I would look forward to having something more concrete further on this year." Will the finance minister explain why she needs so much time to study U-Vent rules, but this government doesn't think the URB needs time to study a 35-year, $1.5 billion contract?
Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to follow those rabbit tracks, Mr. Speaker. What I will say, again, is that when this House is no longer in session, I will be able to get back to focusing on the work that my staff has been doing, looking at the regulatory regime, information from across the country, working through a consultation process with the industry and other interested parties. And at some future point this year, we will see some regulatory changes here in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Hants West in his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The list of interveners to Muskrat Falls continues to grow, but the URB's timeline to review the mega project is not growing. The finance minister told reporters yesterday, when asked about U-Vent regulations, that I haven't put a deadline on it. And when talking about aquaculture regulation, the Fisheries and Aquaculture Minister said yesterday, we take the time, we're going to do it right. And I'll table those, Mr. Speaker, just for the record. My question, will this government explain why they can't take their own advice on Muskrat Falls and let the URB take the time to do it right?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since the member is so intent on speaking about Muskrat Falls, I'm going to refer that to the relevant minister, the Minister of Energy.
The Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to quote from an article that was in today's paper by the board that has ruled that it does have sufficient time to make a decision on the Muskrat Falls project. In fact, in a letter that was written just yesterday, the Board Regulatory Affairs Officer, Doreen Fries, had this to say, and I quote, "The board has not received any requests from board counsel for an extension or any indication that the consultants retained by board counsel have not had sufficient time to review the information related to their scope of work," unquote. So obviously there's sufficient time for the board to make the decision to provide the lowest fairest rates on electricity for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Energy. On November 7th, 2006, the member for Queens spoke at length about the importance of competition against Nova Scotia Power in the renewable sector. Quite a long time in this legislature, and in favour of the very proposals the NDP now attack. And I'll quote part of that. She spoke for quite a long time, so I don't have time to quote the entire thing. "We are doing a disservice to our children and our grandchildren to not act now, not to hold Nova Scotia Power accountable, not just for rate increases yearly, but to hold them accountable to truly move forward, to open up the market and allow true competition," unquote. And I will table that, of course. And I suggest you read the rest of her remarks. Mr. Speaker, why is the NDP so hostile to that idea now?
Minister of Energy. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, as the honourable member would know, we have the ComFit program in this province that is opening up competition to all kinds of community groups and CDFs and universities and non-profit groups, and it's working across this province. We have dozens of applications, and I think at the last count we had like 60-some approvals for ComFit projects. Those could be for small wind, they could be for large wind, they could be for tidal, they could be sustainable biomass or farm biomass. You know, there's all kinds of possibilities that we're blessed with here in Nova Scotia. So we are truly fortunate to have many competitive uses for energy here within Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if the minister reads the member for Queen's entire remarks, he will see that she was talking about the exact bill and regulations which we have introduced repeatedly in this House, which do not require that any of the people that he's mentioned go to Nova Scotia Power for permission to access the grid. Mr. Speaker, of course, but Mr. Speaker, she was not the only NDP member. On November 1st, 2006, the member for Cape Breton Centre, now the Deputy Premier, asked the former Conservative government when they would implement regulations to allow renewable energy providers to sell directly to customers. And I will table that, Madam Speaker. And at the same time, the member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage was voting in favour of a motion at HRM supporting the exact same thing. Mr. Speaker, that's 3 of them just right off the top. Mr. Speaker, so now the Conservatives refused to do it then when the NDP wanted. Now the NDP are joining the Conservatives in throwing rural Nova Scotia, HRM and renewable energy producers all under the same bus. Mr. Speaker, does the minister believe the Deputy Premier was wrong when he demanded the Conservative government introduce competition?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I come back to the COMFIT program as being praised as being one of the best in the world for diversifying our energy mix, for using the natural resources that we're blessed with here in Nova Scotia. And, you know, I'm still trying to figure out the Liberal energy plan. I know some days they talk about putting the HST back on, some days they want to take it off. They want to eliminate efficiency in Nova Scotia. They're going to deregulate electricity. That's a 30 to 50% increase. We know the model in New Brunswick is not working. They want to cozy up to Hydro-Quebec. Just where do the Liberals stand on diversifying our energy policy?
The honourable member for
Mr. Speaker,
Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the only answer that minister has is to make stuff up as he goes along about his opposition. You know, Mr. Speaker, you know, yesterday, as the government members well known, and maybe the Minister of Energy should start showing up for briefings because, of course, what New Brunswick did yesterday was not at all take out renewable. In fact, they said that was one of the things that's working, and they've kept that in the bill and the legislation they introduced yesterday. Sorry to disappoint. But, Mr. Speaker, he wants to talk about deregulation. Well, in fact, there's actually only one party in this House that's ever spoken in favour of deregulation, and it's the NDP. On December 4th, maybe the Minister for Communities, Culture and Heritage should listen for a change. Mr. Speaker, the member for Queens, standing up, praised the Ontario energy model, saying, we need to look to Ontario, a province that is moving aggressively. The expertise is there. We just need to move forward, unquote, and I've already tabled that. Mr. Speaker, will the minister confirm that it is in fact the NDP, as the only party in this legislature, to speak in favour on the record of deregulation, that what they are doing is everything they can to strengthen Nova Scotia Power in advance of their move to deregulation?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the only party that's been promoting deregulation has been the Liberal Party in this country. You know, that plan has not worked. It's not worked in Ontario. It's not worked in Alberta. It's not worked in British Columbia. It's not worked in California. It's not worked in Maryland. It's not worked in New Brunswick. So why is the Liberal Party continuing to promote a plan that has failed, that is a recipe for chaos in this province? And we as a government are going to work on a renewable electricity plan that's green, efficient and tax-free, and the lowest, fairest rates for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Preston.
Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I asked the Premier a simple question on behalf of all women in Preston around the mobile breast screening unit. The response, Mr. Speaker, proved that just how out of touch this Premier is. In a desperate attempt to cover up the fact this government left Preston off the schedule, the Minister of Health and Wellness tabled a 2012 press release. I will table that again. The 2013 schedule as posted on the government website, which clearly shows that this NDP government left Preston off the schedule. Will the Premier explain to the women of Preston why his government cared about them so much when in opposition, but completely ignores them when in government?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the new digital mobile mammography route published on November 5th, 2012 says the following. The new digital mobile route stops are Neils Harbour, Industrial Cape Breton, Cheticamp, Shelburne, Inverness, Preston. Mr. Speaker, I don't know how much clearer you could get than that.
Good one.
The honourable member for Preston on his first supplementary.
Well, that's pretty interesting last year's information. This year, on the website, by this government, it's not on the list. Mr. Speaker, here's what the Premier doesn't seem to get. The mobile unit provides digital service. The Dartmouth General Hospital also provides digital service. The only difference between the two is the mobile unit isn't visiting the community of Preston anytime soon. The wait time for screening at the Dartmouth General Hospital is the second highest in the province. In case the Premier didn't get the chance to read it, I will again table a press release where the Dartmouth General was not good enough in 2001, despite the fact that during that time frame the mobile screening unit and the Dartmouth General Hospital had the same equipment. Will the Premier please apologize to the women of Preston for his blatant disregard for their health and well-being?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't. It just amazes me that the member for Preston could possibly get this. This is the November of 2012 press release to cover 2013. That's the first thing. The second thing, Mr. Speaker, is that we invested in new digital technology for the Dartmouth General Hospital in order to make sure that women from all around the catchment area for the Dartmouth General got the best possible service. Mr. Speaker, was that clear enough?
The honourable member for Preston.
All I can say to this Premier is his website, his government website, now, presently today, does not have Preston on that list. What doesn't the Premier understand about that? Can't you read what's on the website and understand what's going on in your own area? So, I'm going to, you're going to have to explain to the people in my community, a black community, that's not going to get the service this year because it was left off the list of the government site. So I'd ask the Premier to again apologize to the people of my community for not including this year in the...
Honourable the Premier.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I feel very sorry for that community. I got to tell you, at this point, the simple reality of the fact of the reality is that they're going to get the service. They've been told they're going to get the service. The members been told you're going to get the service. We can put it in big print for them. I don't know, Mr. Speaker. They're going to get the service.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Economic Development. We know that trucking contractors in northern Nova Scotia are refusing to deliver another stick of pulpwood to the Point Tupper paper mill until Port Hawkesbury Paper starts paying more. How does the Minister feel about this matter?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you that it concerns me, as I'm sure it would anybody, whether they be in government or anybody on the street, when there's any dispute that goes on around contracts, around labour, when there's work stoppages. I think that this would be a concern to all members. The question is, does it concern me? Absolutely.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the minister might let us know if he's discussed with the mill ways that they could reduce costs. And I'm thinking about things like lowering taxes, focusing the rail subsidy on the area from the mill to the causeway so they can increase the weight on that section of line, because that's where most of the transport is now happening. Has the minister talked to the mill about looking at ways to reduce regulations that may be hurting profits in the trucking industry? That, of course, that we don't want them to damage our roads, Mr. Speaker, but maybe there are regulations that the government can be looking at there. All, of course, Mr. Speaker, to put less pressure on truckers so they can earn a sustainable profit margin.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will pass that off to the Minister of Natural Resources.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly government has worked very, very hard to ensure the success of the mill at Port Hawkesbury, and we're hoping to be able to continue to build on that. Of course, truckers, producers all want a fair product for the work that they do, and also the company wants to remain competitive. So the bottom line here is a fair, workable deal that all can live with.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. I will now call the Government House Leader to call government business.
On the ones that were brought in today. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask for unanimous consent for the bills that were reported back from law amendments earlier today. That would be Bill 80, 81, and 82. That would be Members' Retirement Allowance Act, Builders' Lien Act, Provincial Flag Act, to be allowed to bring forward to Committee of the Whole House.
The motion is to bring those bills back to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills. Are all those in favour?
Everything's okay. Okay. So now
all those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Those against say nay.